Let's take a look at the news, specifically the election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and specifically the election polls. What is a poll? Basically, a bunch of Americans are surveyed, and they're simply asked, who are you going to vote for? And then the numbers are calculated. Say 100 people were asked, then 47 said, I'm voting for Kamala Harris, and 46 said Donald Trump. And then the media and pollsters use that data to try to predict what's going on, but also just to have something to talk about on TV. Real quick, the idea that you're going to learn today is these polls are bad. These polls cannot be trusted, and you're going to hear all about them. And I'll show you why they're flawed. Now, if you want the best polling possible, Robert Barnes, Richard Barris on YouTube, they'll give you the data. I know you're probably not going to watch it, but maybe one or two of you will. These guys have the real numbers. And you might be saying, I still don't really care about the real numbers. I'm trying to not get into politics. And why would I want to look at numbers about politics? Okay, well, let me pitch this idea. Maybe your parents are slightly interested or concerned about the election, and maybe they see polling data, maybe they see it going one way or the other, or he's winning or she's winning. Well, when you're sitting there at the dinner table, building your relationships and bonding, you'll be able to chime in. You'll say, hey, did you know that polling data is bogus and it is flawed and it's all completely wrong? And don't be surprised on election night if things look a lot different than what they have been predicted. And then you can tell them why. Maybe you want to do that. Here we go. Let's do it. So these guys have been saying for quite some time that the polling data or the survey where they're asking people who they're going to vote for, there is response bias, meaning the people responding are biased or they lean in one direction. Now, it's not really something that pollsters are intentionally doing. When they're calling people and surveying, they're not trying to cheat or mess up the data. There's just a problem in who they are calling. It ends up favoring one group over the other, and it makes their numbers look larger. There is clearly a bias. It is not an even or accurate representation. What they should do is when they make phone calls and survey Americans about who they're voting for, they need to represent all of America, all the different groups. Unfortunately, that's not happening. It's not necessarily intentional. And even the New York Times has come out and said, yeah, when we call people and they respond, there is a bias, or there is certain people that respond and there's some people that don't respond. And this skews the data in one direction. This favors one group over the other and creates misleading numbers. And so they quietly say, you can't really trust our data. But they say that quietly. They don't really say it that much. So that's probably why your parents sitting at the dinner table don't really know about this. And the media needs to fill up TV time, so they're constantly putting up these numbers. And they never mention the fact that these numbers are bogus, even though everyone has said the numbers are bogus. How does this polling work? Basically, the New York Times or a polling group has a call center, and they call a bunch of Americans. And they take that data, and they run calculations and try to weight it to a certain extent, and then say, all right, here's what the polls say. Who is winning nationally? Which candidate is winning state by state? But let's break this down and use some common sense. And you understand why there is bias, why this polling is not accurately representing America. So you get a phone call. Let's say they call a college grad. Let's say they call a blue collar worker. Who is more likely to answer the phone and respond to the poll? Just use your common sense. You do not have to be a pollster, a scientist, an expert, or work for the New York Times to know immediately who is more likely to pick up the phone and say, yeah, sure, I'll spend 5-10 minutes answering your questions about politics. That's right. College educated graduates are more likely to respond to the polls. Less blue collar, less people with associate degrees respond, and thus you get bias. They try to weight these things to fix for the bias, but they have admitted they can't really do that. Now, what we see is that college educated graduates tend to vote Democrat more than Republican. So when you do the poll, it's not going to be accurate representation. And the blue collar, middle American tends to vote more Republican. So if we call a bunch of people, but really only the college grads respond, and the college grads tend to be Democrat, what do you think the data is going to look like? Obviously, the data is going to be skewed. There is going to be a bias. This is the response bias, in that the people responding favor one group more so than the other. And so the data skews heavily to the blue, to the Democrat, to Kamala Harris. Barnes and Bears talked about this on their YouTube. The New York Times talked about this. And you'll see right here, 47% of Americans nationally say Kamala, and she's got the lead. But if the data is skewed in her direction, does she really have the lead? If we're talking about 1%, and we know that there's a response bias, what is the real number? What is the real story? And we can see this, and it's been documented by the Washington Post, the New York Times, Pew Research. Pre-election polls in 2020 had the largest errors in 40 years. So the last presidential election, the same thing happened. They were off by 8 percentage points. You might be saying, well, what does that mean? Well, let's just put this into common sense. Real quickly, if you're off by 8%, and every one of those polls below are within 8%, they're all worthless. It could go one way or the other. So these numbers mean nothing. And when you hear about them all the time, this guy's winning, she's winning. How do you know you're off by 8% last time with your polls? Because of response bias. What if you're a carpenter and you're off by 8%? Do you want to live in that house? That is a huge margin of error in basically any industry in any field, let alone if your industry is to predict who will be the president. If we know that in 2020 they were way off, why in the world would anyone trust the polls this time? Because people just forget, and the media just keeps pumping out the polls, and people just keep talking about them. It's something to talk about. The only thing to talk about at your dinner table while you're eating your Domino's pizza and your Coca-Cola. Hopefully you get a better pizza than Domino's, but hey, whatever. Domino's wants to sponsor this video, sure. Yo, go Domino's. Their thin crust isn't that bad. Hey, how about it? While you're sitting there, you can just say, the only thing we need to know is the polls are a joke. And here's another example from political insider Mark Davin Harris. All you really need to know is what's highlighted. There is a historic response bias on surveys this year. They're not accurately polling the right people. They're getting way too many of one group responding. Here it is. Educated Democrats are 3 to 4 times more likely to answer the phone than non-college voters. It is skewing the votes mainly towards Kamala Harris. We don't know what's going to happen, but the one thing that I do want you to know is polling doesn't matter. You can't trust the polls. It is skewed towards one group. It is not intentional. They're not doing something dirty. It's just one group answers the phone, one group doesn't. There's nothing you can do about it. Share those facts with somebody who cares.